All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Walt Pavlo. Walt, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Walt here. So, Walt oversaw about a $2 billion operation at MCI Communications before he was caught in a scheme to embezzle approximately $6 million. He is the co-author of the fantastic book Stolen Without a Gun: Confessions from Inside History's Biggest Accounting Fraud, The Collapse of MCI WorldCom. And I would highly encourage everybody to take a read of that, especially if you're kind of an accounting nerd like me, and like the details. You'll enjoy the details, and then the other thing you're going to enjoy too is the cast of characters that make up this book are fascinating. These are not just, people focused on accounting or finance. These are people with some very, very interesting backstories, and you will be laughing throughout the book. It's a fantastic story of what happened with MCI slash WorldCom. Since his release from federal prison, Walt has made his life giving cautionary speeches about his crimes and the environment that bred them. So he's been kind of warning people about, what can happen if you're caught in a bad situation. And he is also the founder of Prisonology, LLC, and he is a very active writer on white-collar crime and the state of prisons in the United States. And again, I've read many of Walt's articles. And if you're not knowledgeable about prisons or prison life or how prisoners are treated, I think if you read some of those articles, it's really going to open your eyes on the state of prisons in the United States, and you will learn a ton by reading through some of these articles and again how inmates are treated in the United States. It's very, very interesting, very, very interesting read. So again, I would encourage you to check that out. But Walt, there's a couple of things from your book that I just want to kind of get the facts right here, get the story right before we go too far. We just recently finished up a chat with Craig Stanland, who I think you know reasonably well. Now with Craig, we talked about conjugal visits at these prison camps. And what Craig had said is that there's actually no walls in these prison camps. Is that and prisoners are free to white collar, for the most part, nonviolent offenders are free to, kind of roam around. But again, there are bounds. And when we were talking about conjugal visits, Craig did mention that a few of the inmates would make visits into the forest, let's say. And we kind of left it at that. But in your case, you actually lead your book with a story of an individual who not only made a trip to the forest, but then got caught in the forest. Perhaps you can fill in the story on what happens if you actually get caught, because that was something that Craig and I didn't really get into the details on.
Well, in federal prison camps, you're right that, the security is quite low. There's really, no fence, and what fences there are, you can walk through a gate and walk outside. I mean, some of the details associated with work in those prisons are outside. But you're right, that most of the people who are caught escaping are really just going out temporarily, participating in hooking up with someone, drinking liquor, smoking pot or something, and then coming back into the compound. Most of them are caught sneaking into the compound, trying to, they're not caught escaping. That's pretty easy to do, but then they get out and they stay on a little bit too long and they come back. But, that's become, they don't even really hardly record those anymore. I mean, they're just called walkaways. They're not even called an escape, but you can get in a lot of trouble for that. I mean, you risk a lot. You risk a lot for, that little bit of fun that you might think that you're going to have, because you're going to be transferred then to a higher security prison, and, you'll be in a special housing unit for, some period of months. So not worth it.
Not worth it. Yeah. Now, the other story from your book, which was eye-opening, and this is something that, unless you experienced it yourself, like you did, I don't think anybody else would actually envision this happening, is you open your book with a story about how you're going to attend kind of you're in prison at the time, and you're going to attend a conference or a meeting at another prison, which the overall goal is, again, trying to better yourself, trying to learn more, and with the hope that it will actually cut time off your prison sentence.
Right.
Which all makes sense. Which was shocking, though, was when you started talking about the risk of actually hopping on this bus and going to this other prison in that, there's a risk that you may not end up in your location. You may not know exactly where you end up at the end of the day. Maybe just give us some perspective
Sure.
on this whole thing about, the risk of hopping on a bus to go from one prison to another. And because it was actually quite interesting. And does this issue still exist today within prisons in the United States?
Sure. And it's so funny, Scott, that you bring it up because when I first wrote the book, that wasn't the first chapter. I wrote the book in sequence. So what we did is we took the idea of putting something, let me grab the reader's attention right up front and talk about something, prison. What's funny about that though is I never thought of that. I just thought prison was sort of, why would anybody want to know about prison, right? I mean, so when they asked me to put it in there, I was like, hey, I'm going to talk about this bus ride. And the bus ride was moving me from Jessup, Georgia to Edgefield, South Carolina, which is probably about maybe 200 miles away, so that I could go to this other class and program that they had there. But it took me a little over a month to get there by going
Wow.
through various maximum security prisons and then ending up there. And I'm, shackled and handcuffed in a bus with people that are much, much higher security than me. And it was an eye opener. I mean, I was happy that everybody was shackled and handcuffed. Okay.
Absolutely.
I don't want anybody to get a piece of me in there because there were some really, dark individuals in there, that are going to, higher security. When I get off the bus, you go over there. There's like me and two other guys and these 50 other guys, they're marched to the big house. So, probably doing life sentences.
And can you still get kind of lost in the shuffle on these buses? Like is that still a risk today? Because that was the other thing too, is there was a level of concern that you might not find your way back and you may find yourself in a longer sentence than what you actually had at the beginning, right? Does that still exist today where you can kind of get lost in limbo in this busing system in prisons?
Sure, there's a transportation system throughout the Bureau of Prisons taking people from one prison to another. They may be at a higher security prison and now they behave themselves. They're going to move to a lower security. So it could involve this bus ride, airplane rides, across the country. And you just don't know how long they're going to last. I mean, they can last anywhere from a few weeks to a year,
Wow.
that you're just in the US, they refer to it as diesel therapy. So, by the time that you're done with that, you're going to be a much better prisoner because you don't want to get on that bus and airplane ride again.
Yeah, that is and again, you talk about gathering, attention, grabbing details, conjugal visits plus this story of the bus ride. Like I said, in the first couple of pages of that book, you're hooked. And
Right.
and you got to figure out what happened and how you actually landed in this spot. But when you read again those articles, it again takes you into Forbes and what you're doing today in terms
Right.
of understanding the state of prisons in the United States. Like to think that it would take, months to go 200 miles is crazy.
Yeah,
That's insane.
127 prisons in the United States, so there's 122 prisons. So, you can end up in any one of them. They have, if you misbehave at one, they can get you a ride to the next one, a free ride to the next one. It's just not very much fun.
Yeah. Wow. So maybe just talk a little bit about before we get into MCI, your background. Take us back in time.
Sure.
We're going back in time now pretty far. I guess it's 20 plus years.
Yep.
We're going back, but maybe just take us back in time to when you're a young professional or educating professional. Where'd you go to university and where'd you kind of start your career at? Well,
Sure. I went to West Virginia University and majored in engineering, industrial engineering, and I always had I was always good at math. And I really didn't see business as being my thing. But I wanted to learn more about it. And I started off in the defense industry and then worked in that for a number of years and then got my MBA with a, concentration in finance because I wanted to learn more. And that's when they sort of got introduced to accounting. And I said, wow, this is pretty interesting. I mean, if I had it to do over again, I mean, accounting is just such an amazing skill to have, it can be applied to a small business or giant corporations, law firms, anything. It's much like industrial engineering, it allows you to, to really expand. But I wanted to At the time, the 80s were, the mid 80s when I came out of school, and the early 90s was quite materialistic, and the transformation of business in society. We were this is when you had yuppies, right?
Yep.
Young urban professionals, and you know all of a sudden people are paying $30,000, God forbid, for a car, to a BMW that had no room in it, but it looked cool. And you buy an oversized house that had all these bedrooms, but you only had just a husband and a wife living there. So it was really the chance of moving, really seeing that you could propel yourself upwards with dual incomes.
Yep.
Used to be you had one primary care, breadwinner. Now you have two, and their salaries are comparable. And now
Yep.
instead of making $50,000 a year, you're making at the time 100, which is a lot of money.
Yep.
So, there was a lot of things that were going on at the time, and I definitely got caught up in that, like country clubs and things, and very materialistic. But that was the way the United States really looked at the time. This was, the Reagan era moving into, the Clinton era here in the United States.
And then how did you come across MCI? So you started, you're an engineer by trade. You started to learn finance slash, maybe take us back in time a little bit about, because MCI Communications, the name I don't think exists anymore. I think they were
Right.
acquired, but, so I don't think you'd find them today. But back in the day, was a different situation. This was a growing company. Maybe just give us some perspective on the decision path to join MCI
Sure.
Communications at the time and what they did. What was their business model?
Well, so I was in the defense industry, heavily regulated. I learned a lot. Big companies. I worked with the Goodyear Aerospace, then went for General Electric Limited of England. And so I was working with really big companies with a lot of oversight. MCI was in this telecom. And you had to think at the time, we had AT&T phones. That's all that there was.
Yep.
There was just one phone company, Ma Bell, right? And I was like, how do they have competition? How can there's only like one wire going in and out of your house. How can somebody else own that wire? And I was just intrigued by it. And these companies were just growing fast. And there was, for the most part, MCI they described it as a law firm with an antenna on top. It really was a lot of, you had to break up this monopoly. And how do you break up a monopoly? And then how do you make money from the monopoly? And so I was reading in business magazines about, and newspapers, about this deregulation. And, deregulation was big, big monopolies are bad, more competition's good. And then you start reading about, innovation and great companies. And MCI was just one of them. I mean, it was in the same league as like Enron at the
Yep.
time. How do
Yep.
you, a natural gas company, here's Enron. They don't even own any natural gas. I mean, they're brokers, they're business dealers. So the same was with MCI. So it was a telecom company. It wasn't a phone company, right?
Yep.
It was something more. It wasn't, what else is there? And, at the time they were developing great products like email. It
Yep.
was called MCI mail. And, and we used to brag like, hey, I got 30 MCI mails today, So, I mean, there was just all kinds of stuff. And you were starting to see how this might play into your everyday life, and certainly how it would help you in business. And that was an instant attraction. And MCI was run by entrepreneurs,
Yep.
and everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Even if you don't have an idea of what an entrepreneur does, it just seems aggressive and open and give me your ideas. And the way MCI was hiring at the time was taking people from established businesses and say, hey, bring that knowledge into this wild west where we are. And this is how we're going to build this. What are your practices out there? Because we're just growing like crazy.
Yep.
And that's how it was just so enticing. I'd heard about an opening, interviewed for a couple of things, and they, boom, stuck me in a job.
And maybe just talk a little bit about that job, because I think this is another area where the job that you did back then doesn't exist anymore. Like what you, and again, the way you articulated in the book, and again, I think that what you did will surprise a lot of people, especially what you were doing, it wasn't necessarily a traditional, finance type of role, but maybe just talk a little bit about the business model and then how that led to actually what you were actually doing and who you were actually dealing with. Because again, that type of role, I don't think really, it certainly doesn't, maybe it exists in other industries, but it probably doesn't exist in the big telecoms today.
That's true. The job that I got was in billing and collections, which, dear God, does that sound boring as hell, right? It was,
Until you read Walt's book.
yeah, exactly. But I was like, well, I'm not a very big guy, and I go collections. I mean, how am I going to? I mean, I'm not a mean person. You owe me money, whatever else. What am I going to do? But we worked in the resale division of MCI, and that's what my job was, collecting from other resellers. Now, if I were to ask someone like, how many telephone companies do you think that there were, or telecom companies, in the mid 1990s, that were selling, you might say, I don't know, 30, 50. I mean, there were thousands. I mean, thousands of them. I mean, they just came up with these ideas. And in essence, Scott, they weren't even telephone companies. They were marketing companies, right? They would just go in and they would say, hey, MCI Telecommunications, I'm going to buy, I'll throw a number out, 100,000 minutes from your network at a really low price. And I'm going to go up to a little suburb in Boston, and I'm going to sell to all the hotels and the businesses in there at a markup that's probably going to be less than what you would sell them to, MCI. And I'm just going to make that money on the margins. And
Yep.
and that's what was going on. But the other thing that started happening was innovation of, that's just a straight resale there. But the other thing was innovation of products. And 900 was a huge business. 1-900 sex, 1-900 fortune telling, 1-900 just give me information. And it was really the precursor to the internet. And, that allowed people to dial 1-900 and some number and receive some service, on the other end.
And
So
pay a
this is
ton for it. Pay like you're paying top dollar for
You're paying a
that.
lot. I mean, really, today it would probably be, sex phone call, probably the equivalent, like $200-300, right? I mean,
Exactly.
it was crazy. But you can imagine that we sold a lot to, the AT&Ts of the world, and, even WorldCom was a client of ours, and Sprint, and they're just, using part of our network, but we're also using theirs. So there's really not much markup that we can give there. Everybody knows
Yep.
what the deal is. But this other group called Tier 3 customers were involved in all these 900 and sex lines and all this other stuff. They were really fly-by-night companies. And that's really where all our margin was coming from. That's
I
where all the
see.
profit. So you don't have to even be an MBA student. We can sell $100 million of services to AT&T, but we're also we can't mark it up any, because we're also buying from AT&T. So our profit margin's under 1%. But we can sell to Walt Long Distance, who has all these sex lines, and be making, for every dollar they, cost, or a dollar a minute that they use, we're making like 80 cents a minute,
Yeah.
So you multiply this by millions and millions of minutes, and you're really making a lot of money. And that's sort of what the market is. And today's market does exist, but mostly they've learned a lot over the years. And also, most of the market that does exist, the innovation is sort of gone out of telecom, and it's just a wholesale product, so it's a commodity. So, there's when you make a phone call on your phone and it comes to mine, it might pass over 3 different people's networks, and they, in the back room, put all those back together. So that's
And
what exists today.
I guess, your role was billing and collections. I guess you weren't charging these 1-900 lines up front. You weren't collecting the cash up front, which I guess is really one of the, I guess you could say, the flaw or whatever, but you
Sure.
weren't you weren't charging these guys up front to use the MCI lines at the end of the day.
No, we looked at them as a consumer, the same as a consumer. It's like, all right, so let's just say that it's January. In January, they have usage, they're using our network. In February, we send them out an invoice, and then in March, they have to pay it, you know?
Yeah.
But what you realize really quick, Scott, is that if a person now is billing $1 million a month, by the time that their invoice is due, they're into you for 3 months. And so it's not a $1 million invoice is outstanding. You have $3 million all together in the pipeline. And then you have to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? This person's not paying me. And then, by the time you figure that out, okay, now they're into you for another million. Now you're up to 4
Yeah.
million. So it's rolling really, really quickly. And that's what we were seeing. Just a lot of guys running up these invoices, collecting a bunch of their money, never paying MCI, jump them off of our network and going over to Sprint, going over to AT&T. It was just the big guys were really getting hammered by these guys.
Well, and I love, there's a quote in your book too, when you go out to talk to one of these guys and say, hey, look, like, we're going to sue you. He goes, well, you go ahead and sue me. I actually don't own anything. All I do is lease it. There's a great quote in the book, which I'm not going to repeat, but he basically says everything he has, he leases. So you're welcome to sue me as much as you want. So you're building up these massive bills, and you don't really have a lot of recourse against kind of these mom and pop shops that are
Sure.
selling these cards to whomever. Is that kind of a fair,
Yeah,
representation
that's
of
fair. And also, as you're out there and you've got your MCI star and logo and commercials and everything that are going on, do you think MCI wants to be known as the person that sues a mom and pop telecom organization, even if they've
yeah.
ripped them off? It's, becomes a bad press idea too. So, you find yourself in this terrible situation of, trying to collect. What do you do? Repossess someone's home, that owes you, even if it's $1 million home, that's not a good look. And those are other issues that we were running into.
So what's happening then is that lots of revenue is being recorded. Receivables are starting to build up against kind of these customers that again are kind of are mom and pop shops, and they're building up millions of dollars. And the ability to go and collect from these folks is very challenging. And obviously, MCI wants to kind of maintain their profits and their revenue growth and everything along those lines. And maybe just talk about what sort of accounting culture then that's going to create in the group. Because I think we can all see, the pressure that it's going to put on. You talk a lot in your book about dealing with the salespeople. Salespeople are obviously going one way, saying, their bonus based on, or their commission based on billed revenue, not necessarily collected revenue. And you can just see the tension building up. Like you can feel it in your book. You know what I mean? That the tension is building up. Maybe just give us some perspective on what that tension was like on trying to kind of make everybody happy,
Sure.
and making sure, this business model continues to move along.
Well, I will tell you, one of the things that's interesting about accounting is that you don't actually have to collect the money in order to record the money, which seems like, as an engineer, it's like how much weight can this bridge hold, period? There just didn't seem to be an answer. So, when you create that invoice, you've created an asset on your balance sheet, which is an accounts receivable,
Yep.
and you've recorded revenue.
Yep.
And when the person, the company doesn't pay, then you have to write it off. Well, the question is, when do you write it off? How do you write it off? And that's the subjectivity where we found ourselves is like, well, on paper, going after these, terrible clients, these highly risky clients that we're making a lot of money on the books, it looks really good, but they're not paying. And how long do you give yourself to try to turn the market around? Can you make them pay? Is there a
Yep.
way to get yourself out of this? But it's moving at such a rapid rate. I mean, like I said, it's millions and millions of dollars
Yep.
accumulating each month. So you're trying to figure out, like, what can I do? And that's the part that got us in trouble. It's sort of like, all right, we have all these millions of dollars. And then, you feel like your accounting professor says, okay, Walt, when should you write this off? Or I raise my hand and say, well, I think we should write it off now because these guys are never going to pay us. Is that the right answer, teacher? And they go, that's a terrible answer.
Yeah.
You can't do that. We're going to have to slow it down. What can we do to slow this down and portray our idea as still a good idea while we work on really trying to improve it? Because I really want to tell you is that I always believed, and everybody around me believed, that we could actually fix this stuff, over the period of time, that, I don't know, magically somebody was going to pay, or we'd find other customers who were going to pay that would make up for the losses. And
Yep.
that just never happened. We just ran out of runway and just kept getting bigger and bigger dollars. And that was the real problem. And, and higher ups didn't tell me, and I think I talk about this in the book. I don't really recall anybody ever saying, "Hey, this is how you cook the books." I think what I heard is, here's the numbers that we have to meet. What can you do to help us meet those numbers
Yep.
and make them look like what they're supposed to look like? And when they did, they just didn't ask any questions. They didn't want to know. I can see that now as an adult, but at the time I was like, man, this is pretty cool. I'm looking at me like I'm important. There's pressure, but there's also a power trip of like, wow, I'm solving a problem for my business and helping everybody around me.
Yeah. And at what point, at what point did you start to go from, call it the white hat to, the more black hat? Because there was the accounting on one side, the aggressive accounting, but then it started to turn into something more than that, which we'll talk about in a second. But I just wanted to talk about your mindset, because the way you talk about it in the book is you almost started to build up a kind of an anger towards the company. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like almost like I just don't like the company anymore. And it provided a justification for what was going to happen next. You know what I mean? Maybe just talk a little bit about that transition. Well, is at what point did it go from, you know what, aggressive accounting is one thing. We're allowed to do judgment in accounting. So, we put that aside, whether our judgments are right or wrong. But at some point it started to get to be more than that. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that is fair. There came a point where, and I see this in other white collar crimes and talking to people, the amount of risk that I was taking on for very little gain was incredible. I mean, I'm hiding tens of millions, $100 million in bad
Yeah.
debt for our company. And there's really nothing in it for me, tangible. Yeah, I'm getting stock options. Yeah, I get to keep my job, but I'm not really, for the risk that I'm taking, it was, way too much.
Yep.
And then I sort of saw, you know, what I believed was sort of a lackadaisical thing by senior executives to say, hey, he seems to be handling it and we're enjoying all the fruits of this, but the pressure's on me. I
Yep.
mean, it really is on me to keep this good news coming.
Yep.
And that's when I got really resentful. And then I started thinking about, well, it's really not my boss's, problem so much. Look at these scoundrels that are stealing all this money.
Yep.
They're the ones making even more money,
Yep.
by not doing it. So, I start, not liking the customers. I stop, not liking the people that I work for. And then I'm looking at myself and I go, what the hell am I doing?
Yep.
What a sucker I am. I got all this pressure on me. I'm missing kids' birthdays and all this other stuff. And, here I am. I think that I'm doing something good, but just sort of all culminates. And then that leads me to sort of reach out to somebody like, I need a sounding board. I don't
Yep.
know what I'm doing here. Do they know what I'm doing? Is it what I'm doing illegal? Is it right? I mean, can I quit?
Yep.
What can I just didn't know what my options were at the time. Could I quit? If I quit, would I get in trouble after I left? I didn't know. So,
So then the idea comes up through, and I'm just going to try and simplify it, is that really what you do is you go and create a company in, let's call it Bermuda, and you approach your customers and say, hey, look, instead of paying MCI, pay this company and we'll deal with the MCI situation. So like almost kind of like, like a factoring or something like that. But at
yeah,
the end of the day, you're diverting cash from the customer into your company in Bermuda. And then that company in Bermuda obviously doesn't make any payments back to MCI. And at the MCI level, you're able to convince a few other folks to kind of go in with this and book some journal entries to kind of make the bad debt expense go away. So customers send cash from, instead of to MCI, into Bermuda, and then basically write it off as bad debt expense within MCI. And like, were you surprised that actually worked within MCI? Like, was there just not a lot of oversight over bad debt expense, or they just didn't want to hear the bad news? Like, what do you think it was, Walt, that kind of made that particular made that particular arrangement work so effectively? You know what I mean?
Well, let's take one step back. I mean, the person that I confided in was in the telecom business. His name was Harold, a good Canadian, right?
Yep.
And I sort of told him what was going on. He had the same question that you just had. It's like, where's where's the oversight? How do you do this in accounting? How do you hide bad debt? Because I was telling him the pressure that I was under. And then he was the one who had expertise in offshore accounts. Of course he
Yep.
did. He was been in the telecom business, he knew all about shady banking and everything else. So, our idea, what sold me on the idea was making money. Like, I can't, there was a way for us to make money. But number two, it solved the problem for us because now I was going to give this perceived loan to these telecom companies by, hiding their bad debt. And then they had like this financier, Harold, who was like overseeing their books and, like, hey, we got to start running this company better. So Harold and I are meeting, going over the financials for these companies and making them pay MCI on time. Yeah, they were paying the Cayman Islands on time too, but it didn't seem like there was a victim. Wasn't going to be
Yep.
allowed to write it off anyway.
Yep.
Came up with it. Now I'm making myself a little bit of money. And number three, everybody's like back to being normal. These are like good run companies. So to me, I went to these, long, means of trying to rationalize my behavior so that it didn't look like I was stealing. Because I can tell you what, Scott, if I could have gone to any of these telecom companies that are ripping people off and say, hey, you guys have a invoice outstanding of $2 million. I need $500,000 in a duffel bag and I can make it all disappear. Who wouldn't take that deal? These guys
No,
are
no.
scoundrels. They would have loved it. I mean, but and
Exactly.
I will tell you that question was posed to me at a New York University Stern School of Business student who said, if I were you, Walt, this is the way that I would have done it. And I said, but that's like stealing.
Yeah.
This other way that I did it made it look like I wasn't stealing. It seemed like there was something to it. And
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said about how you rationalize your behavior, even going to great lengths, because I could have done it much easier. Really, I could have gone with a duffel bag, filled it up with cash,
You're right.
and then I'm just going to write it off, and then off I go. But instead, I got this
That's right.
elaborate scheme.
So, I was talking to one of the CFOs in our group, and I was sharing telling you a little bit of in advance of our discussion, and Tyler had said to me, he goes, Scott, he goes, I am stressed out enough in my normal job, just dealing with everything. If I had something on the side like this, the stress level would go through the stratosphere.
Yeah.
And I said, well, when I read Walt's book, like the stress that Walt is under is coming through in like, again, it is almost like bleeding out of the book. Like it would seem at some point, it was like, going nuclear type of thing. Like the stress was just it was going to kill you if
Right.
you didn't deal with it. Again, you're married, you have kids, you've got the stress of your normal job of everything. And then you've got the stress of all this Bermuda stuff. And then where again, it really starts to be probably more stressful is when more people kind of outside of the circle
Right.
start getting involved. And then you're like, okay, well, this is starting to spin out of control. Maybe just talk a little bit about the stress and what a typical day was like, because, obviously alcohol played a factor and, there's a lot at play, but the stress level was through the stratosphere at one point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it builds and builds and builds, and particularly when it comes to like substance abuse, particularly alcohol. I mean, that's the greatest soother of all times. You're
Yeah.
sitting there and having a nice, beautiful martini, and the world just sort of melts away for you. But the thing that I often think about, the student who challenged me, like, this is the way that you should have stolen the money. It made, I created so much stress on myself trying to keep this elaborate thing going. And you had asked earlier, like, did I think it was going to work? I didn't think it was going to work. I mean, I thought for sure that, I had even planned, like, if somebody said, hey, Walt, this seems sketchy, I would say, yeah, then let's not do this deal. I'd already prepared that in my mind, but just the opposite happened. People start hearing about these refinancings that Walt is doing with his buddy and Harold, and everybody's calling me and like, hey, Walt, I want my client to be next. And it was like,
Yeah.
this is unlimited. We could make it. I don't know how long we can go, how much money we could make. It's just going to be too much. And then all that stress and my job, 99% of my job is doing legitimate stuff, which is already stressful.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
1% is, ridiculous amount of stress. And it's not like I can even write that down. You can't have like a, to-do list of the bad deals that you're working
Yeah.
on. So you have to keep all that in your head, and that becomes really, really difficult. And that led to a lot of the stress. And, my out came, and I see this with other white collar guys that I talk to. How do you get off of this horse?
Yeah.
I mean, now you're running in a full sprint and you're like, what is the exit strategy? And there isn't one. You just keep riding. But the exit strategy that did sort of come my way that I thought was going to hide all this was when MCI was going to be purchased by British Telecommunications. And I said, you're going to have this big, and you know all the accounting. How many times did they have somebody merge and then they go, hey, there's a one-time
Oh
write-off or
yeah.
an
Oh,
adjustment,
100%.
we're cleaning
100%.
everything up, and they
100%.
take all the dirty laundry, and I go, oh, this
100%.
is going to be perfect. They'll never
Mm-hmm.
find it in this freaking
Yep.
mess. And I just ran out of time. They sort of discovered it, which we'll talk about shortly before I got to that ending. But I'm still convinced that this day, I would just end up quitting and cashing out and just hope that they didn't find it. But nobody would have ever known. I sure as hell wouldn't have written a book about it.
Yeah. I think I think that's right. So how did it end? Well, again, you were, like I said, they were hopeful that the acquisition would go through, but it unraveled before then. Maybe just talk a little bit about how it ended at the end of the day.
Well, I think for any auditors that would listen to something like this, I mean, sometimes it's just a simple question that starts to unravel something. And, in my case, I was, asked about a transaction that had moved one of these journal vouchers. And, hey, well, can you explain a little bit more? We're just wondering why $1 million moved from here to there. I mean, can you just give us a reason and fix it? No, certainly nobody calling me out on it and say, oh, are you stealing money and putting it in Bermuda? That wasn't their idea. But in my mind,
Yeah.
that's exactly what I hear them saying, right? Hey, Walt, what is this transaction? What are you doing? Question me about that. I don't want to talk about that. And then, they start pushing and they're like, I quit. I just don't want to, I just can't do it anymore. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, whenever I'm going to tell you, the only way that I can relieve this pressure that I'm under right now is to tell you the truth. And
Yep.
if I tell you the truth, I'm screwed
Yeah.
because I can't do that. I mean, so the thing is, I just quit. And, after, being asked a few of these questions, and it was sort of like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah,
And
because
then,
you're quitting as well right before there might be a big exit event because you're leaving options on the table. You're almost quitting and saying like, why is this person quitting? It
right.
literally makes no sense at all why someone would leave just before their options are going to vest on a liquidity event, right? With that, it
No,
just
didn't even, you know what? And I can still remember what could have been worth the time. $1 million.
yeah,
I didn't even think about that. I mean, one, I have money in the Bermuda.
yeah,
So, I mean, so like, what is this money? What is it for? What is it going to do? I just didn't even think about that. I mean, by that time I'm gone, mentally just exhausted.
and at what point did you realize that what you've done may result in prison time? Like when you first started it. You start on aggressive accounting. Would that result in prison time or not? I don't know. In some cases, in some cases it could.
Right.
You talk about the Bermuda company. At what point did you then realize that, man, like this is serious? This I may actually have to go away for potentially a couple of years for what I've done here.
Well, I mean, talking to an attorney, first of all, who do you talk to? And I talk to a lot of people who are looking for attorneys and stuff, and they're conflicted. Like, why am I going to tell the truth to a perfect stranger?
Yeah,
Right? And that becomes really difficult. And I had a great attorney, Bruce Morris, and and when I went to him, I lied. I just said,
yeah.
hey, I was doing some accounting, and I don't know what they're talking about, and they're just picking on me in essence.
Well, you
And
have a
I'm sure
great quote from your book. You have another great quote from your book when he catches you in a lie. And you say, did OJ tell the truth when he met with Johnny Cochran? What was the answer to that question, Walt? Do you tell your lawyer everything, or do you hold back on some select things?
Well, the prelude to that was that Bruce, who came back from a proffer meeting, sort of, like kind of just like, hey, I got a client. What are you guys saying that he did? And so, he went away to that meeting, and I was highly confident that when he went, that, they weren't going to tell him much, at least I thought. And he came back and said, hey, before we talk about anything else, can you tell me about the money in Bermuda? And I was like, holy shit. I mean, it was like, that's just like, why cut right? Can you not give me a little bit of buildup? Why did you have to jump right on that? As soon as he told me that, it was like, I don't know what else he knows now,
Yeah.
I mean, so that's when I came up with this, this line like, did OJ tell his attorney? And
It's a great line. It's a question I think we'd all ask ourselves. It's a great it's a great line.
right.
So
Well, he told me, he says, if he were smart, he did.
yeah.
He says,
Yeah.
because you've got to tell me everything. And if you don't tell me everything, I can't help you. And I really don't want you as a client, but
Yeah.
I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to tell you. You just got to tell me the facts. Let me work on how we get you out of this, the best way that we can. He didn't say he was going to, do any trickery or anything. We're going to use the law and we're going to hit this head on. And, that probably took about, over 2 years of sort of, negotiating and, delays. These things just go on and on and on. They just don't, hey, we think you're in Cayman Islands, we're going to indict you. I mean, that takes a year
Yeah.
to do that. And it took another 6 or 7 months of trying to, and then other people that are involved in the crime, they stopped returning my phone calls. So they're, I know they're telling on me now. And, then at the end, I just said, I got to put it behind me. I feel comfortable with where we are. And I'm just going to have to manage with this prison time. So to, answer your original question, it was really, shortly after my, what did OJ, tell his attorneys after that he, laid out that, like, you can go to prison for this. And, we got to minimize that as much as we can.
So it finally comes to a close. You end up spending time in prison for these issues. And I'm just wondering now, when you look back on it now, Walt, in 20 plus years later, would you have done anything differently, and what would you have done differently? Like, is the answer in those situations to just say, screw it, I'm going to quit? Does he, I don't know if you would have told other people with an MCI, if that would have actually made a difference or not, if that was kind of the accounting environment that existed. Maybe if you had more of a conversation with your wife or some of your loved ones about it, and they would have just said, like, well, you need to get out of there now. You need to, when you look back in hindsight, what's the one or two things that maybe you would have done differently? Or maybe the answer is, you know what, I wouldn't have done anything differently. But what do you think? Well, just as advice to people out there who might be in a similar situation, like, how do you deal with that situation?
I think the early on is to ask questions. That's, the original title of the book was called Company Man, which was like what I felt that I was. I was a yes man. And that's
Yep.
really, that's a character flaw that I wanted to be accepted. I was smart enough to make some things happen. And I liked the adulation that came with that and the rewards that came with that. And that was a deep character flaw. And I didn't ask a lot of questions. And if I had to do over again, I'm not going to say whether I would have quit or not. I mean, that would have obviously been an easier choice. And I wouldn't say that I wouldn't have gotten into it. But I think had I questioned more about what people were asking me to do at first, provided maybe some pushback just in the form of questions like, well, what accounting rule are you guys looking at that allows me to do this? Because I'm happy
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Just show me the rule. And
Yeah.
I can tell you what they would have done, Scott. They would have stopped saying, this ain't the guy for the job.
Yep.
We need the yes guy. And they would have found one. They will find one, to do it. But, for me, the best thing would have been more questions. And I just didn't ask any. I went, they asked for a solution. I gave it to them.
And you talk a lot about your first boss that you had at MCI, former military guy, kind of not going to take any bullshit. You know what I mean? Do you think that, and I realize trying to play things out now differently, trying to go and apply hindsight and how things, like, it's obviously it's impossible to do, But that your first boss moved into a different role in MCI shortly thereafter. Do you think if he stayed in that role, Walt, do you think it would have played out differently? Do you think, do you think it would be a different outcome, or do you think it still would have been the same outcome?
It would have been much different. It could not have happened under
Yeah.
him. I mean, it just, I actually told him that years afterwards to say, I'm not trying to blame anything on you, but I'm just telling you from my perspective, it's impossible. I couldn't have done it. He asked me a ton of questions. He was, you know, he knew everything. I mean, our debriefs were some of the most intense, and by the way, pressure of that job didn't have to be just on on the cooking the books and all this other stuff. I mean, it was a lot of pressure in the job anyway. And, he was just a guy of responsibility. He knew how far to push you, and then he would sort of back off. But at the end of the day, he knew that the decisions that were going to be made from our department would be made by him. So
Yeah.
I felt covered. It's like at the end, if I say, hey, I can't do, you got to tell me, boss, what to do. I would have he could have told me to do damn near anything, but I knew that he would have handled it much differently. The other guy just wasn't qualified.
Yeah.
He just wasn't qualified to do the job. And, he was just looking for answers, and that was it. That was nothing more than that.
And look, you spent a lot of time after being released talking to a lot of different companies on best practices in control environments and ethics training and all that sort of stuff. You know, what do you think were some of the core, weaknesses in the control environment at MCI? And is there a best practice today that would say this is how this is how you address it? Obviously, the business model itself puts the company at risk if you're going to, charge that much money to these customers and not bill them up front. Again, you're going to run into that problem. But do you think they're like, again, maybe it's, delinking bonuses from accounting results, where
Mhm.
how much, whether you write off $1 million or 100 million, it doesn't matter. It's not going to impact your bonus at all. Maybe keeping the salespeople away from the accountants, like just keep them away. They shouldn't even be allowed to call. In all your conversations, I'm just wondering is there one or two core weaknesses, and is there any sort of best practices that you would suggest out there that really deal with those, that address those core weaknesses?
Well, the Sarbanes-Oxley, the decisive monumental legislation that came in about controlling corporations and what they disclose and their
Yep.
accounting practices came into be because of MCI and MCI WorldCom and Enron. I mean,
100%.
Adelphia, there was a few others that were in there, but that just tells you what the culture was around the United States.
Yeah.
When I walked into any MCI office, our stock price was at the front desk. We were
Yeah.
compensated highly by the stock price. It was heavily influenced. Wall Street analyst reports were given to all the managers. This is what they think, your segment, this is what you're going to get. I
Yeah.
mean, we were reading those and being influenced by those. Your audit firm and your consulting firm were the same firm.
Yep.
That's illegal now,
Yep.
so
Yep.
so many things have changed as a result of that. And not that they necessarily were illegal themselves, but there was no check and balance there where you could see where, they could lead to. So, all of the things that were wrong in business were there for other companies, but they took greater care to do it. MCI didn't. And, one of the things that we had talked about, some of the information you had sent me before, you were like, well, how can a company like MCI stay in business if their customers aren't paying you?
Yep.
The same way that they did for Enron and these other, customers, is that your stock price is your currency, not your
Yep.
revenue.
Yep.
And as long as your stock price reflects like something that they think that they're, that your company is going to be, the investors will send you more and more money. Your debt, your ability to loan money is at a reduced rate,
Yep.
and so money's flowing into the company all the time. So, you don't necessarily need revenue. You need the perceived revenue to be what it should be.
And when you look at best practices, let's say in ethics trainings and things along those lines, how do they deal with those pressures? Because, or how do they explain to people on how best to deal with them? Because those things are going to exist. If you're a public company,
Right.
you're going to be able to read reports on yourself. That stuff exists out there, that those pressures are going to exist. But then it's almost incumbent on the companies to kind of walk their people back and just say, look, like, this is what you need to focus on. Is there a best practice out there that you see that or even just how ethics training is done? You talk a lot about it's not just doing a questionnaire and saying, hey, okay, look, we've got 1,000 employees. Everyone needs to log into this web page and do this, watch this 15-minute video and do these 3 questions. You know what I mean? Like it's got to be, which I think is why even when you go out and speak to them, that is meaningful. That's a meaningful conversation because again, you see the consequences of what can happen if things go
Mhm.
off the rails. Is there best practices in ethics training that you see? Well,
Well, I do think that, the companies try, and I know I think it's got to be tough if you do work in a corporate. I'm going to tell you, I would never do it again.
yeah,
I've had my fill, but I think it's a constant reminder. And I will say this: we just didn't have any reminders when I was at
yeah,
MCI. I
yeah,
mean, if you were going to management training, you were skipping out on work.
yeah,
You were just,
yeah,
So I think there's more of a, just as in the workplace, but I think that the cautionary tale is always very powerful. But to your, point, what can corporations do? And you bring up a really good point. Of course, there's pressure. You can't just go into work and say, "Hey, everybody's just here to have fun," and don't
yeah,
feel like you do. You got to have any pressure. There's like
exactly.
that company's going to suck. All right,
Yeah,
you got to have goals, but the goals have to be realistic and they have to be measurable. They can't just say, "Hey, you know what? We're doing $1 million. We want to do 10 million next year." Okay,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
how are we going to do that? It's got to be measured, and companies do have to have a responsibility because one of the things that I learned in my thing, Scott, is you have to be careful what you ask your employees to do because they actually might do it,
100%.
right? So if you say, "Hey, I want," there was this went on banking industry in Europe, where they had all this fraud there, and what they ended up showing is like, "Hey, we got to go bring in new clients. We got to make big deposits into our bank." And what they found was their salespeople were out there buying bribes, you
Yeah,
know, prostitutes and taking them out to dinners and buying them cars and vacations and all this other stuff. And yeah, they're throwing their 10 million or $50 million into the bank, but at what cost were they doing that? So they met their goals, but at what price?
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. The other thing that I felt that was interesting in your book was one of the core elements of internal controls is segregation of duties. Is that
Right.
maybe one person would go offside, but to think that there'd be 2 people would go offside, that the risk of that is a lot lower. What really surprised me in your book is that you were able to recruit an individual to help you book journal entries and things like that. And when that individual finally left, you actually recruited another individual to kind of help out. Just some thoughts on segregation of duties. Like obviously, I guess in the MCI control environment at the time, the fact that multiple employees could kind of be looped into this is maybe an indicator that the control environment had some issues. But your comments on segregation of duties, like why do you think in your case you were able to convince not just one, but 2 people to kind of come over to your side?
Well, the segregation of duties it was the main, you know, way that I was able to get away with this. And, segregating duties is inefficient when it comes to business operations. It'd be great if you could just go to one person and
100%.
solve multiple problems. So it disguises itself as an efficiency, and in many cases, it does work as an efficiency. Unfortunately, in a you know, and it also provides an opportunity where something untoward can go down, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, and my bosses and the people looked to me like that I had multiple sort of titles and responsibilities, and nobody was looking because it allowed us to get things done quickly, and that also became like an easy way to recruit people or hide transactions that I was doing, things like that. So that was you find a lot of times that just because something is efficient doesn't mean that it's going to work out well for the company in the end. And this was certainly one of them.
And just going back to ethics for a minute, do you think that good ethics is trainable? Like again, there may be a view out there to say, look, certain things you're born with, you know what I
Hmm.
mean, and certain things like your upbringing and things like that.
Hmm.
Your the upbringing that you spent, ages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 type of thing. Those early days are wiring your brain in a certain way. You know, do you think that that's true, or do you think like ethics is trainable? That if you can go either way, is that you would take a person who, let's say, had good ethics, you put them into an environment that doesn't, that sees the world in a different way and gets them over. And on the flip side, you had someone, let's say, who came from an environment of poor ethics. You drop them in a good ethical environment and provide them with the proper training, is that they can then flip. Do you believe in that? That you can, that it's a trainable skill, no different than, say, accounting or engineering or whatever it is that if you train them properly, that they will do what is, they will make good decisions at the end of the day.
I think so. I mean, and it sounds far-fetched, but I do believe that that is the case. And I think the responsibility for the company is to also say that, in providing parameters under which a person can work, that they're going to be safe, right? That they're going to, provide, it's a job. You go and you work from 9 to 5 and then you go home. The company sets that standard. And I think that talking about ethics, telling everybody this is what our company is, this is our company history, this is what we stand for, all very important things. We're totally missing at MCI.
Yeah.
That's not to say that MCI was a bad company. You just got to think of, I am 28 years old when I go to work for MCI and thrown into all this stuff here. It was so exciting, and it's just like, there's not, it's like, okay, my parents are out of town for the weekend and
Yeah.
I'm
Oh no.
inviting all my
Yeah.
buddies over. And so it was just like, it was just, no oversight. And I think that was a bad thing. And, I'll go back on cultural wise too. You know, MCI was also like, so many young people had such high, you know, positions. I mean, if you
Yeah.
go back and look, CFOs of the year, consecutive years, one was Andy Fastow at Enron, who was like
Yeah.
35 or 36 years old. And the other was Scott Sullivan from WorldCom. I
Yeah.
mean, what are there's probably some pretty good CFOs out there. There's not many at 35 years old. I'm just saying, maybe, they could maybe make it to 45.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely, right. I think that's a great point. And you talked earlier, Walt, that you do talk to a lot of folks, white collar criminals that get caught up in things. And like you say, it's not like you're in it all of a sudden. It's kind of like a
Yeah.
gradual thing, right? Where, and then all of a sudden they maybe wake up one day and say, shit, like, I'm way over my head. And so if there was somebody listening to this that was saying, you know what, that's where I am. Like I am in way over my head. I don't know what to do. What would be your advice to them, Wald, in terms of how to, you know, how to deal with that? Like what is the exit plan when you're up to your neck in quicksand, and how do you get out? Like what do you have any advice for anybody who'd be listening who would be in that situation?
Well, I tell you, I look at where I was, Scott, like the day that I pled guilty to the day that I started down this bad path. And I say any day before the day that I pled guilty that I should have done it. You can go back at any of those days. It's really the reality of having to make a very difficult, decision. And, some of the hardest decisions are your best decisions.
Yeah.
And, I could have decided early on, like, I'm not going to participate in this. And guess what? They could have fired me. They could have embarrassed me. They could have put me up, and that would have been tragic, you know.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
I look back in retrospect, I would have much rather been fired than what had ended up happening to me. So if you look at anywhere down through there, I mean, I was faced with a difficult decision that I refused to make
Yeah.
and just sort of went along with this tide. And, I've had people, to your point, I've had people call me and say, well, I was in this like a Ponzi scheme, and I got a check for $200,000 that came in from this older couple who just told me, I can't wait to invest this money with you. And they looked at the check and they go, I cannot do this any longer.
Yeah.
And really, in essence, turned himself in, went to his employer and just hired an attorney and said, go to the authorities. I can't live with myself anymore. It was a few $1,000,000 by that time, but he just said, I can do this too, till you guys really catch me. And by that time, it's going to be terrible. I got to get out of this. And that's a difficult, difficult decision to make.
And is there a sigh of relief at the end? Like, again, you're keeping all this stuff inside of you, you know, is there a point now, maybe it doesn't come the second after you admit, especially when you're talking with your lawyers about, prison time and things like that. But is there a longer view that say, look, at one point you'll be glad you did it? You know what I mean? Because in the long run, you're going to be better off. You're not going to be stressed out. Like, did you have that moment where all of a sudden it was like, you know what, I'm cool. I'm good with how things have played out. And, my stress level is like down here as opposed to
Right.
being way up at the, through the
Right.
stratosphere a couple months,
Yeah,
years
sort
or
of
months ago.
realizing that you're a normal person, right? And
Yeah.
is that when you do confess and come forward, it's like, okay, I'm still alive.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, you sort of look at your
You didn't
appendages
kill
and
anybody. You
I
didn't you
didn't
didn't
kill
kill anybody.
anybody.
You didn't
R-
hurt. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it's a different type of issue than a violent crime. 100%.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So you're just sort of like, hey, okay, here I am. I've got my family. I've got some, some bad stuff that's going to happen to me, but
Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm going to have to manage through this. And it's sort of realizing that, wow, how far have I drifted from what was a normal life? And and now in confessing, I'm getting back to the normal life, but I realize there's a ways to go, but at least it's like, okay, now at least I'm not going away from it anymore. I'm going, I'm turning this boat around. And that was, a really it was a huge stress relief. Just immediately dropped to be able to talk to FBI agents and tell them what happened,
Yeah.
go to a board and start writing stuff out. It was just like, it was all same thing with the book. It's just like, I got to get this out of me. What the
Yeah.
hell happened?
Yeah.
And then when you do that, it's like, now you don't own it anymore. It's sort of like, that's the story, that's it. That's what happened.
So you get released from prison, and I think, one of the things that, again, I've also learned through all of this is that it's not that easy to just get a job coming out
Right.
of coming out of prison. I think you had a great quote in your book, actually, that I wanted, or not in your book, sorry, in one of your articles that I wanted to ask you about. Is you had said the hardest day wasn't going into prison. The hardest day was actually leaving prison. That was the harder day. Maybe just articulate on
Sure.
that, because that was certainly a quote that makes you think, you know what I mean? And, I don't know if you've seen the movie Shawshank Redemption,
Sure.
but there's a situation in there where, again, it's a different issue, but the person actually really struggled getting back to, one of the people that exited prison actually really struggled with trying to get back into normal life. But it's a very interesting quote. Maybe just talk a little bit about what that quote
Sure.
actually means.
It wasn't that I wanted to stay in prison, but
Yeah.
there's certainly a safety in prison. I mean, nobody's judging me in prison, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's a criminal, right? I mean, we don't even want to talk about that stuff. Let's talk about volleyball, or you can sort of put your life behind you. But then, when I'm leaving prison, I sort of realize, okay, one, I got to find a job. I got to figure out where I am with my family. I've been away from them for going on 2 years. What dynamic is going on there? How do you put it back together? What do I do when start thinking of small things? What do I do if I go to my kids' games?
Yeah.
Everybody gonna look at me? I mean, they see me in a grocery store. Do they say hi? I mean, I went through all those feelings. I mean, I'd see
Yeah.
people in a grocery store when I first got out, and you would just see they take their cart and say, I'm just leaving the store. I mean,
Yeah.
because they just don't know what to say, right? So, and my life did take a pretty bad turn. I mean, I was divorced,
Yeah.
after all this happened, and
Yeah.
trying to keep my kids as part of my life. And it was extremely difficult, and those things start rushing at you in those last few days of prison. Is like, none of my buddies here got to go back to this mess that I've got back at home. I got to go do this myself.
Yeah.
And that was really, really, really difficult for me. Really difficult.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. So you get out, and you enter into a career of kind of going around and telling your story, and helping people, design better control environments, talking to companies, talking to young professionals, talking to students, talking to the FBI,
Right.
telling your story and saying, look, be careful. This is what, and I think, I think everybody understand that career path, and that's clearly, again, there's a lot of good there. But what's then interesting is that you then transitioned into writing about, the state of, white collar crime and the state of prisons, which then also turned into a business venture for you. Maybe just talk a little bit about
Sure.
how that journey sort of started.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about it, I just really presented myself more as a case study. I was really fortunate to work with the FBI, big accounting firms, and we really would just tell a story, just like I'm telling to you.
Yep.
Giving advice wasn't really part of what I did. It's like, let those guys give you advice. I can just tell you what I did
Yeah.
wrong. I'm not an ethics expert. I'm not an expert in accounting, obviously, but this is what I did. And then you guys
Yep.
take from it what you will. And then Forbes came to me. Neil Weinberg was at Forbes, and he said, "Hey, we're starting blogs." I mean, just date myself now. And I said, "What's a blog?" And he was like, "Well, you just write about experiences or something. And maybe you could write about white collar crime." So, I started doing that. I've been doing that for, close to 16 years now.
Wow.
And it was, first of all, I just say it was sort of good to be on your end of the thing, Scott, instead of my end. Let
Yep.
me talk
Yep.
to people about stuff,
Yep.
and get their stories out there. But then I had this idea. I saw so many defense attorneys that were, excuse me, prosecutors who were turning their lives and becoming defense attorneys. So I said, why can't I use Bureau of Prisons experts to help in mitigation for defendants that are heading to prison and talk about what prison is going to be like for them, if they have cancer, if they have dementia, or whatever the thing is.
Yep.
And so that's what we did. Started about 10 years ago, and now we work with federal defenders all over the country. I would say, the majority of our clients are indigent. We work with some white collar folks. Any of the high profile cases that you talk about, somebody been arrested, those are our clients. We tell them about what prison's like, where they could go, what programs are available, what are they eligible for, how do they get their sentence reduced, by the law. And, we that's what this has turned into over the last 10 years. And it makes me feel good because we help provide information to courts about what a prison looks like, and also help guide the individual a little bit so that they feel like they have some control over their life, because eventually they're coming back to society.
100%.
So, you got to give them some feeling of control, and just say, hey, if you go in there and reflect on what you've done and come out, you can be a better person. And here's the programs that I think would be good for you.
And your typical white collar criminal, would it be fair to say they know nothing about any of this stuff? Like
Right.
how like their knowledge on what happens to them, again, because I've talked to a couple of them, and they were joking around saying, their view is that they're going to end up in a place very similar to Oz, the old HBO show from the early 2000s. I remember joking with Craig about this, saying, if I ended up in Oz, like that's it for me. I would not last very long in Oz. But that's not the typical path for a white collar criminal. Maybe just talk a little bit about
Sure.
what would happen to what's the process, or what's the typical path for a white collar criminal? How does it typically play out for them?
I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who've talked about taking their own life,
Yeah.
and when they're looking at 2 or 3 years in prison. I
Wow.
mean, they just, to them, their life is over. And, settling them down, and, they can see me. I'm on the other side of this, right? I went to
Yep.
prison. Now
Yep.
I'm out. And now I'm talking to you. So, just letting them know that is, it helps, but they're lost. They don't know anybody. Usually worked hard their whole life. They have a good education. They've strived, they worked so hard, and now, they have this in front of them. And that's really what, I think they just don't know how to handle it. And what I do is just sort of like, hey, this is how you manage it. This is what you're going to be doing. Don't focus on prison, because prison is not shuffleboard and tennis courts and pickleball courts, nor is it, gang rapes and,
Yep.
getting beat up all the time. It's you're going between the two. Here's what it is. It's somewhere in the middle, and it's certainly manageable. So that those are tough discussions, but that's probably the most rewarding part of my job. Is I see in them the same that where with the same way that I must have felt at the time when there is no internet, there is nobody to talk to. You just
Yep.
can't go around the grocery store and say, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody who went to prison. Did you go? Do you know somebody that went? I need to talk to them." Now with obviously, internet, social media and stuff, you can find people like me. So, that was something that I'm, it's a rewarding part of what I do.
And do they typically settle down? Like, do they normally, once they kind of process it and everything like that, do they kind of prepare themselves mentally for what's about to come through, and they're usually able to they get through it?
Yeah, they do. And it's still though, putting their shoulder to the door to walk into prison and do that is still really difficult. And it takes them a good month to get their feet under them. But after
Yeah.
about a month, they realize, okay, I can do this. Whether it's 2 years, 3 years, or 10 years, they sort of get it like, okay, I've got the routine down. I'm safe. I don't want to be here, but I can muscle through this. And it takes just a little while. But, we deal with tragedies in our life all the time. People have
Yeah.
cancer, it's dialysis, car accidents, divorce. There's lots of things in our life that are big disruptors. This is just one, but like all the others, it too is manageable.
And what is life like in a prison camp? Like, maybe just talk a little bit about, because like you say, before I became aware of a prison camp, that wasn't certainly what I would have expected,
Right.
for a prison. But maybe just talk a little bit about nonviolent offenders in the US and kind of where they spend their time in prison, because it's not in a place, for anybody that's seen Oz, it's not in a violent prison as depicted in Oz. It's a different, it's kind of a different environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's social structures there, where people who've been in the longest have more seniority and stuff. But basically, you have a job, you go to a couple of classes, you have 3 meals a day, and then you find time to read, reflect, do some recreation, and you just do that over and over again. It's sort of like, you know, a life without much responsibility, which creates like, my family's dealing with, stuff on
Yeah.
the outside. And, I'm just, I wouldn't say worried, but the next thing on my agenda is playing volleyball in the afternoon, so like, it's sort of, you do get a break from society, but at the same time, it's frustrating because you want to be, back in the game. So, you find ways to get by because you have to. I mean, you just can't
Yeah.
sit in a cell all day and go, okay, another day down and mark the X off. I mean, you gotta, I gotta read a book. I gotta do something. I gotta interact with other people. I gotta take care of myself, and, that becomes a mission. And, you become, consumed by the prison environment. Like, I got to participate in everything in here so that I can get out. So, I mean,
And do the
it's
days go by pretty quickly, or is it a slow grind? Like, if it's 2 or 3 years, is it a long 2 or 3 years, or do you kind of get into a routine where the days start to go by quickly?
goes by quick. It
Yeah.
takes a while. The first month is as you would expect, it seems like a year. The second month seems like a half a year, third, until you're sort of cruising. And then it starts to be like, okay, I got 6 months left.
Yeah.
And then, that starts coming at you pretty quick too. It's like, because now you're starting to worry, like, all right, what's my life going to be like? I'm going to have this joy of getting out of here. But like, there's not like a birthday party. They throw a party for you when you come home. It's sort of like, everybody's like, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
Do we welcome him home? Do we not? Do we have a party? Do we just kind of one by one? I mean, it's really difficult to explain, do you bring it up? Okay, what happened? I always tell them, read the book. Just just read the book. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, no, it's certainly interesting. Now, the other thing I want to ask you too is, obviously one of the goals of prison should be to rehabilitate
Sure.
and that part of the process. And do you think the prisons do a successful job of we'll just talk about white collar criminals, the violent criminals, maybe it's a different situation. But if we talk strictly about the white collar criminals, do you think these prison camps and the processes do a successful job of rehabilitating the folks that go in there?
I think that they try, but one of the things I'll tell you about prison is pretty much a self-paced program. I mean, if you don't want to do anything, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to reflect. You don't have to do. There's not like they don't have some deprogramming of your criminality class there. They offer classes that if you want to improve yourself, you can. Some guys don't take advantage of that, and there's no way to force people to do it. So, you can make the most of it. What I have seen is that for most white collar guys, one, they don't want to experience. You got to think by the time that they go to prison, their cases have been going on multiple years.
Yeah.
It's not like they just they go and stick up they rob the convenience store and then they go to prison for 5 years and they get out. It's not like that. I mean, it's 4, 5, 6 years leading up to a trial or to, pleading guilty and then being sentenced to prison. I mean, I know a guy had a 7 year, period of incarceration. His case had been going on for 10 years
Wow.
by the time he was sentenced. So time he gets out, it's almost 17 years. And then he's got 5 years of supervised release. It's 20 years of his life, that have been involved in that. So they tend to get their mind right and, go on and become better.
And what is you've written some articles as well about the reoffending rates. Is that when the white collar criminals come out, people might say, oh, you know what, like I'm not going to employ these folks. Once a criminal, always a criminal. But if you look at the data, that's not really the case, right? Is that, that the people do deserve a second chance. And when they deliver a second chance, in most cases, again, we're talking about white collar crime, is that the reform rate is actually pretty good. Is that fair, Walt, based on what the data is showing?
It's fair, but you're bringing up a good point. But I've often wondered: is it because part of it is because they've gotten their mind right. The second thing is they don't have the opportunities that they did in the previous life. Like nobody's hiring me in a corporation to to do accounting. So you're more thankful for the opportunities that you do have, but you certainly don't have the opportunities to just walk into a business and you know be in that level of power or whatever again. It just
Yep.
doesn't happen. So, there's a lot of it, which is really difficult for white collar guys because, you know, being an accountant or being in finance isn't illegal. It's not like selling cocaine,
Yep.
before you went in, you sold cocaine. Well, before I was accounts receivable, was in collections, I was doing a job. That's really difficult when you get out because you could go back into the, business, is not illegal in itself, but if you're, shuffling money to Bermuda, it is. So, it makes it a little bit more difficult, for somebody gets out and go, hey, I'm not going to sell cocaine anymore. Okay. That's that's very, very nice of you. But now, what are you doing if you're a white collar person? How do you manage your way back into, society? And that's, and professionally, what are you going to do? That's a real challenge. And I think that most white collar guys that I know are so thankful for a second chance, whatever it is, because usually it is something very different from the profession they have. It's like, I'm not screwing this up. I
Yeah.
just can't screw this up.
And do you think, part of the reform is just when you're in prison, your freedom is taken away from you and you sit there and say to yourself, look, I never want that to ever happen again. So I'm going to do whatever I possibly can to make sure that my freedom is not going to be taken away. And do you think that's just a big part of the reform is just kind of the isolation and the removal the removal from society and then, obviously getting put back in.
Sure.
Do you think that's a big part of it?
It is a big part of it, but I tell you what's even a bigger part is that prison is manageable, right? I mean, you can come up, you can, there's friendships, there's recreation, there's reflection time that you can do in there. That's manageable. What isn't manageable, it is the most excruciating is what you do to other people. What is this doing to other people? Missing your
Yep.
children's lives,
Yep.
your
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
the relationships, all your relationships. I mean, look, I most of the people at MCI reached out to me after the book was written and said, "Hey, I appreciate that you did that. I didn't know all this stuff was going on." And all they knew was like, "Wow, Walt was a really bad guy." I don't want to know him anymore. And then they read the book and they go, "Oh, damn, I wish you would have told me.
Yeah.
I wish I could have helped you." And I think that those, you know, I think, you know, reflecting on what other people, how this hurt other people in their lives is more of a reason to, stay away from this stuff. It just, what it did to family and friends and, your coworkers is really can't be underestimated. I mean, those are the people who really got stung in even the things that I did.
Well, and you talk about marriage and divorce. I was listening to someone talk the other day, and they were saying the divorce rate, when somebody goes to prison is, north of 80%,
Yeah.
because you can imagine, you'd say, oh, well, they can come and visit you. Well, okay, well, what's the process to come and visit you? Is that, you're going through, you're going into a place you don't want to be there to begin with. You're bringing your kids in there. You got to probably go through metal detectors and whatever. And then is there a wait in line? Like just even if you make it to the sentencing and day, 6 or 7 or 8 in prison to then last the next 2 years as well is
Mhm.
incredibly difficult. It's not that easy.
No, it's tough. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. It's not like just, like a service person going overseas and stuff. There's pressures associated with that, but at least there's some honor associated with that too.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, I'm doing this for the good. If you're keeping your homestead while your husband's in prison or your wife's in prison, you know, there's not that level of, civility about it. It's really, it's really difficult. The shame and everything associated with that is really, really tough.
Well, this is a great conversation. I guess the other thing that I want to ask you is there's been so many movies and series about white collar issues. Did they ever talk about turning your book into something more than a book and
You know,
and
you,
and 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 something on the screen, or that wasn't part of the plan?
You know, it's the book wasn't even part of the plan. The book, just to go back onto that, the book was really Neil Weinberg interviewed me for Forbes magazine while I was incarcerated. A big article out there called Ring of Thieves. And, he wrote that for Forbes, and it was a big centerpiece, magazine piece, really in-depth reporting. And then he encouraged me to write a book because it says like, well, you sound like there's a lot on your mind here, like
Yep.
you need to write this down. And he says, if it's looks like a good book, I wouldn't mind working on it with you. So, the book itself was first therapy. Then Neil read it and he says, hey, I think I can make something out of this. And then we put the book out. And then, have I thought about movies and stuff? I guess anything to tell the story. I mean, to me, the movie is me going out and giving a presentation in front of 3,000 people who work for a large accounting firm who are new hires.
Yep.
So, it's a story. And I think there's power in stories and when you look at ethics and stuff, how do you teach people? I think there's a lot of good lessons from this story that is, worth telling,
A
and
hundred
I've
percent.
always thought that.
I totally agree with you, and it's I love the story. I love the book, and I totally agree because I think if we're being self-reflective as well, and we say, look, if any of us were put in that type of control environment, could we foresee ourselves ending up into a similar place that you ended up in? I think we could see that. And
Right.
again, like we're all humans. You mentioned you're in your 20s, you're at the start of your career, you're not in your 50s,
Right.
with all this experience. I think again, if we're being honest with ourselves and self-reflective and say, hey, let's put any of us in this environment, we certainly would have been tempted. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
and we'd certainly be under pressure. And I think, we could all see as well, saying, you know what, could I have ended up there? Yeah, I could certainly see how it could happen. So it's a great, like I say, well, it's a great cautionary tale. Well, thank you. I would encourage everybody again, read that. We talked a lot about the book, but I would check out, Prisonology. If you run into
Hopefully,
issues, then
hopefully,
yeah. but
hopefully
but
you don't have to call me on that one, but
but if you do, check out his website. But over and above that, again, if you want to get your eyes opened on the state of prisons and get a little bit of a different perspective on white collar criminals and some of the issues that can happen, in U.S. prisons, and there's a lot of injustices and things like that as well that are going on that Walt documents. Check out his articles on Forbes. Again, if nothing else, you are going to learn and you're going to get educated on a topic that you probably don't know all that much about. I really enjoy your Walt. So thank you very much. We
thank you,
really
Scott.
appreciate you taking the time. It's much appreciated.
All right. Thank you.